Or that we live, David? It's 9. Welcome to the hearing for the Planning Commission, County of Santa Barbara, for the 28th of March. If you'll join me in the flag salute. Thank you. Mr. Villalobos, if you'll do the TV coverage announcement and roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Planning Commission hearings are televised live on County of Santa Barbara Television, CSB TV, Channel 20 at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orchid areas. Rebroadcast Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 p.m. on CSB TV, Channel 20. Today's hearing will also be streamed live on the County of Santa Barbara Television's webpage and will be available for download in a day or two. Now for the roll call, Commissioner Park.
Present.
Commissioner Farini.
Here.
Commissioner Brown.
Here.
Commissioner Cooney.
Here.
And Chair Blau.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, if you'll do our agenda status report and the projection report.
Good morning, Chair Blau, members of the Commission. On the agenda today, we have 2 items on consent, and then there are two items that are listed on the standard agenda, and staff is ready to present those today for you.
Great.
Moving to the projection report, the next time we will meet will be March 28th. There are a number of items listed. Oh, that is today. We are meeting. So catching up with myself, I got this echo going on, so. Okay, the next meeting will be April 4th. There are 3 items listed on that date for the Planning Commission to consider. There's an appeal, there are 2 appeals on that date, as well as a project from the Energy Division for your consideration. On April 11th, there are currently no items that are listed on that agenda. And then moving down the projection report on April 25th, it indicates that Commissioner Farini will be absent that day. There are 2 items on there. There is an appeal of the Patterson Avenue project, as well as the ordinance amendment that is being proposed to amend the ordinance for like provisions that is being brought to you on that date for your consideration. The impetus behind that is to be able to move that forward to the Board of Supervisors, in addition with the changes in the Coastal Zone Act, as well as the LUDC, the Montecito Land Use Development Code, so that the Board of Supervisors can make a decision on that ordinance amendment. Then on May 2nd, we will be back. It currently has the Abbott track map returning to you for your review on May 2nd, as well as a cell tower, as well as the 101 project by SB CAG. The widening project will be brought to you at that time. And then the long-range planning has a couple of items for you to review as well, which include the Eastern Goleta Valley Environmental Sensitive Habitat Overlay, as well as the Ag Employee Dwelling Ordinance Amendment. There has been a request on the projection report that I can address right now with you, is in regards to the May 9th. There are currently no items listed on that one. However, there's been a request to switch locations similar to today for the May 9th and the May 30th hearing, to allow the May 30th to be in Santa Maria, so that the Hube structure ordinance can be heard in Santa Maria. So that's something for you to consider, is if you wanted to change those locations. Okay, so once again, that was to...
Yeah, and I don't think that requires a vote, but I'll just poll my commissioners in Santa Barbara. Are you okay with May 30th being in Santa Maria? I'm seeing nodding, so I think you're good to go, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chair Blau. And then returning to the projection report, we will And then that addresses the May 30th. So on May 30th, the hearing will be in Santa Maria, and that'll be the hoop structures as well as the 5-year capital improvement program that will be heard at that time. And then June 6th, we have one item on there from Long Range Planning, which is the Coastal Resiliency Project. And then I think that's good as far as the projection report goes to today.
Okay. Any further questions? Not seeing any. Great. Okay, now is the
Commissioner
time
Blau?
in the hearing for, oh, sorry.
Commissioner Blau,
Commissioner Cooney, go forward.
I just wondered if we were going to take any action with regard to April 11. We have no items on that agenda. We could wait until next week to see if anything's added. I'm not sure what Mr. Wilson has in mind there.
Mr. Wilson.
Chair Blau, Commissioner Cooney, as of right now, there are no items projected for that date. If you wanted to trail it to the end of this meeting to cancel it in case anything from today was continued to that item, but otherwise it'd be okay to cancel that if you wanted to.
Oh, that's fine. Let's wait till the end of the meeting today.
Great. Thank you. Okay, now is the time on the hearing where we invite public comment for items not on today's agenda. I see no slips in the box. I see no one rising. So with that, we'll go to Planning Commissioner's information reports. Do we have any from South County? Not seeing any. Next item on the agenda will be the minutes of February 28th.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Thank you. Any further questions or discussions, corrections?
Yes, Mr. Chair. The face page of the unapproved minutes indicates that it's the hearing of February 28, but then as you move back in subsequent pages, we have at the top the hearing of August 11, 2010 for a couple of those pages, and oh, they're all August 11, 2010, but they appear to be the matters that we discussed in our February 28 meeting, so I assume it's just a computer problem.
Mr. Villalobos indicates that's correct. He will make that change. So with that change, if you will read the roll call, Mr. Villalobos.
Commissioner Park?
Push it again. There you go.
Approved.
Commissioner Farini?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Brown?
Aye.
Chair Blau.
All right.
Motion passes 5-0.
Great. And do we have a director's report this morning?
Good morning, Chair Blau, Commissioners.
Good morning, Dr.
Pleased
Russell.
to be here. So there were two hearings to report on with some fairly interesting items at the board. On the 13th, we took the Bell Street Ordinance Amendment and tentative map, and that was Ray's first trip to the Board of Supervisors. She did a great job, and everybody liked it. So that little problem that was discovered by the fact that this project was on a through lot and wanted to put residential on the ground floor in the back and has now been solved, so we're very appreciative of that. Oak Hills Estates also went forward, and it got continued to a future date because the board was not satisfied with the mitigation. They felt that it was a little bit too much of an infill type mitigation when the impacts were to a more coherent block of habitat. They also wanted to see a pocket park. So the applicant was amenable to those things, and will be coming back at a future date with some revisions to the project. The Coastal Resiliency project went to the board for comment, and they really made very, very minor comments. They just things like, make sure that it's clear that you can repair new development once it's constructed and continue to repair existing development, just very, very minor comments. And so now that will be coming back through the planning commissions, and it is on your future agenda, as Mr. Wilson just informed you. So that'll be moving rather quickly. On the 30th, there were a couple of big cannabis items. One was the license. Mr. Bozanich took the cannabis license package to the board, and the highlights there were that through the licensing, the board would like to not allow any outdoor cultivation in the coastal zone and limit the amount of cannabis that can be grown in the Carpinteria Greenhouse Agricultural Overlay District to 186 acres, which is quite a lot, actually, but those were the two sort of greatest hits of that. And then the uniform rules also went forward. Both of these are going to require a return to the board. The uniform rules will go back on May 1. And for the uniform rules, the two major issues that were discussed and tentative decisions made were, one, the issue of whether cannabis should be a compatible use that is somehow limited in the amount that can be grown on a Williamson Act contracted land, or whether it is just to be considered like any other crop, a production agricultural crop on Williamson Act, and can be grown as much as you want on the contract, on the land. And that's what they decided. They decided not to call it a compatible use, but basically consider it to be a crop that is just like any other in terms of how it would be treated, at least in terms of the amount, the acreage that you could grow on Williamson Act contracted land. So fairly positive towards the cultivators. And also the other issue was how much of if you're going to do processing on site, how much of that has to come from the site? Well, our typical standard is 50%. That's what we use for grapes. And in this case, they decided to lower that standard to 10%. So I think they were looking at issues of concentrating as much as possible the processing of the cannabis to fewer sites rather than forcing it to be distributed across more sites. And so they said only 10% of what you process on site has to come from the site itself. And with that, I will say that this is my last director's report. Tomorrow is my last day with the county. I have considered it an honor and a privilege to serve the county and work with the planning commissions these last 8.5 years. I'm looking forward to the next phase. It's not really a retirement, as it is a reinvention. 20 years ago, I was a curator of archaeology and professor. I had no idea that I was going to go into planning. And so I completely changed at age 42 and embarked on what I never had anticipated, which is a career in planning, ending up with being the director of planning here in Santa Barbara County, which is really great. It's one of those things where you make a decision and you have no idea that where it's going to take you, and then you look back on it and you go, well, that was a good decision. There's been a number of accomplishments that we've made here that the planning commissions have been integral. But the one accomplishment that I just want to mention, besides all the community plans and the ordinances and the projects and so forth, the one that I'd like to mention is we've been really engaged these last couple of years in succession planning. But I don't just mean getting ready for me to leave, and Diane will become the director basically tomorrow, and congratulations to her. That's fantastic. She's going to do an outstanding job, of course. She'll be here for a year, and then they'll be starting a search for a director pretty soon, I would imagine. But we've been working to establish capacity and resiliency all throughout the organization. top to bottom, all sorts of different training, trying to establish leadership, a culture, a lot of leadership training, some of it focused on particularly, we have a program for our entry-level planners and other staff in other divisions. We have programs for some more senior planners who want to move into being supervisors, another for supervisors who would like to become managers in the future, and another for managers who would like to take Diane and my jobs potentially. And we've been doing all sorts of different things. I don't think I've seen a department so engaged in the 20 years that I've been doing this. Very happy about that, and I think that the department will be in very good shape moving forward. With that, I say thank you.
Let me just say thank you and congratulations going forward in your continuing your career. So that sounds great. Going to miss you a lot.
Thank you, Chair Blau. Appreciate that.
Chair Blau, I'd like to add that it's been a personal pleasure to work with Dr. Russell in all aspects of his position as director. I think it's certainly been a progressive time for the planning and development department, but what I'll remember the most, I think, is how open your door was, how available you were to not only members of the commission, but members of the public. And as far as I'm concerned, the department has never been in better hands. And thank goodness Diane is willing to transition because then we're sure your legacy will be carried on into the future. And our personal thanks for all you've done for us this last 8.5 years.
Thank you very much, Chair Cooney. I appreciate it.
And if I just may add, I think all the words have been used that I would have said, but I do want to thank you. I do appreciate how open you were to receiving everybody and all the things you did for the community, because I know your door was open, and I think that's very important for many of us who are community advocates. And we certainly wish you well, and going forward, I hope you have a lot of fun. Not that this job hasn't always been fun, but it's been really good to see how you've worked with the board and easily navigated the political environment, because sometimes that's a very treacherous thing in your position. So congratulations to you and all your achievements, and thank you.
Wasn't perfect. I made some mistakes, none fatal.
None fatal. Well, that's the important thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I believe we'll go now to our consent calendar for 2 items. And Commissioner Freeney, you're going to need to make the motion on the first item. Mr. Will is a partner of mine in a couple of business enterprises, so I will be abstaining from voting. And if anybody wants to have this item pulled off the agenda and discuss it, I'll need to leave the room. But unless you do that, I will just sit here quietly while it is processed. So with that, Mr. Bilbos, if you'll read it to the record, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is a hearing on the request of Laura Gauft, Studio 2G Architects, agent for John Will Family, LP, owner, to consider case number 17TEX31, application filed on November 21st, 2017, for two-year time extension to November 28, 2019, for case number 06DVP16, and to accept the previously adopted mitigated negative declaration, case number 07NGD, pursuant to the state guidelines for the implementation of the California Environmental Quality Act.
Commissioner Blau, yeah, so I'd like to move for approval on the consent agenda, but first make sure no other commissioners see a need to pull it.
We're fine up here.
So there's my motion.
And I'll second the motion.
Being no further discussion, Mr. Vilbos, if you'll call the roll.
Commissioner Park.
Aye.
Commissioner Freeney.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney.
Aye.
And Chair Blau.
Abstain.
Motion passes 401.
Great, thank you. Now if you read the second item into the record, please.
The following is a hearing on a request of Kevin Barnard, agent for the Los Alamos Community Services District. Consider case number 18 GOV1, application filed on February 12, 2018, for the determination that the drilling of a new groundwater well and the installation of a pertinent equipment conforms with the comprehensive plan of the County of Santa Barbara pursuant to California Government Code Section 65402A.
Thank you. And Commissioner Parks, this is a third district item.
I'll move for approval.
Second.
And being no further discussion, and I see we have no speaker slips, no one rising, so there's no public comment. Mr. Villalobos, will you read the roll, please?
Commissioner Park,
Aye.
Commissioner Farini,
Aye.
Commissioner Brown,
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney,
Aye.
Chair Blau.
Aye.
Motion passes 5-0.
Great, thank you. Now, while Ms. Eddy comes forward, if you'll read the first standard agenda item into the record.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is a hearing on the request of Mark and Sarah Suppet, owners, to consider the appeal case number 17 APL 20, application filed on November 3rd, 2017, of the planning director's decision to deny land use permit case number 17 LUP 270, and to determine that the approval of the land use permit is exempt from the provisions of CEQA pursuant to State CEQA Guidelines Section 15303.
Thank you. And this was a continued item, but I will ask if there has been any ex parte or site visits since the last hearing. Seeing no one, Ms. Eddy, you're going to give us the staff report this morning.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Chair Blau and Commissioners. We need to bring up the presentation. Okay. So yes, I'll be giving the presentation this morning for the Supoots appeal, which was last discussed at your January 31st hearing. So just to review, the project site is located on the north side of Highway 246, and it's approximately 5 miles west of the city of Buellton. The site is 10 acres in size, and it's zoned for agricultural uses, and it's located in an area that's surrounded by other types of agricultural uses, and those include vineyards and cattle grazing operations and some equestrian operations as well. So at the January 31st hearing, your commission discussed that the production of spirits from wine grapes and fruit is consistent with the Land Use and Development Code definition of a winery. It's compatible with the production of wine. And your commission requested that staff return with findings to uphold the appeal and approve the project consistent with the winery development standards in the Land Use and Development Code. The requested findings for approval of the project are included as attachment A to your staff memo. The project description includes the conversion of an existing agricultural barn to a winery, which would produce 2,000 cases of spirits, brandy and vodka annually per year. And the brandy and vodka would be produced from fruit which is grown on the project site and also would be brought in from other sites within Santa Barbara County. The operations would include mashing, fermentation, distillation, aging, dilution, and bottling. The winery would not be open to the public, so there would be no special events or tasting or any organized gatherings. And the application does request a modification to allow for a 35-foot reduction in the 100-foot setback requirement from the eastern property line. And I'm going to have a slide later in the presentation where I'll go over that. So this is the overall aerial photo of the site. You can see the barn is located in the southeast corner of the site, and that's which would be converted to the winery. And then this is the elevations. The upper photo is the current design of the barn, and the applicants are proposing to repaint and reside the barn and also add a new door to it. And the North Board of Architectural Review has conceptually reviewed this design change and is supportive of it. The applicants are also proposing to install some new light fixtures on the barn. There are 3 new light fixtures and then 2 existing fixtures which would be replaced with the one that's shown on the slide. This is the floor plan of the proposed winery. The majority of it would be used for winery operations, and then there is an area there on the western side which would just remain in use for agricultural storage for the existing orchard operation that's on the project site. This is the project's proposed landscaping plan. The applicant is proposing to remove some existing sod and some non-native trees and bushes, and then install approximately 10 citrus trees and some new native plants there on the sort of the southeast corner of the winery building. So as I discussed earlier in the presentation, the applicant is requesting your commission to grant a 35-foot reduction in the 100-foot setback requirement from the eastern property line. And the Land Use and Development Code does allow your commission as the decision maker to grant reductions in the setbacks, provided that it's for a legally constructed existing structure which was intended to be used for agricultural use, and that the use of the structure as a winery would not adversely affect neighboring property owners. And so in this case, staff is supportive of the request for the reduction. The existing barn is a legally constructed structure which was intended to be used as a horse barn for a previous equestrian operation on the site. The project site is located in a rural area of the county, and that is developed with agricultural uses and some low-density residential development. And the nearest off-site single-family dwelling is approximately 700 feet northeast of the project site. And also, finally, the winery would not be open to the public, and so any private visitation to the winery would be by appointment only. And so the winery would not have adverse effects to neighboring property owners. A CEQA exemption has been prepared for the project under Guidelines Section 15303, which exempts the new construction or the conversion of small structures. The proposed project is consistent with the comprehensive plan, including land use element policies as well as visual resources policies. It can also be found consistent with the winery development standards and the agricultural zone district standards. Staff recommends that your commission uphold the appeal, make the required findings for approval of the land use permit, including CEQA findings, determine that the project is exempt pursuant to CEQA Guidelines Section 15303, and grant de novo approval of the project, including the requested modification for the 35-foot reduction in the setbacks. And that concludes staff's presentation. I'm available for questions, and also the applicants, Sarah and Marcos Suput, are also here.
Great, thank you. So my commissioners in the south, do we have any questions of staff?
Oh, I do, Chair Blau. So it's interesting that there's no text amendment proposed for this, for the winery ordinance. Because this really is a distillery. It's not, I mean, I guess there's a blurring of what this project really is for me, just in thinking about it and in going back and reading about it. Because it's not really a winery. They're not really a distillery, even though as a distillery it has similar characteristics. What happens in wine production may have some of them. So can someone explain that to me? Was the
Chair Blau and Commissioner Brown, the reason that we are referring to it as a winery is because the direction that we received at the last hearing and then in our further review of the project, we determined that the project could fall under the definition of a winery, which the definition states that it includes the processing of similar spirits to wine, which are made from fruit. And so since the proposed the vodka and brandy that's going to be produced at the, essentially that will be distilled there, is made from fruit and it's a spirit, we felt that it fell under the definition of a winery, and so we're referring to it as a winery. So that's why we didn't
And
have
so
any
what will-
ordinance amendment
okay.
proposed.
And so, what does the organization call itself? What does the business call itself?
Chair Blau and Commissioner Brown, they do call themselves the Rock 12 Distillery. I believe that's correct.
Okay. Okay. And then my last question is, it says that the area is only going to be used for private visitation by appointment only. Now, I don't know what that means. Does that mean they have 10 people by private appointment only, or one by one, or it says it wouldn't be open to the public, but I think you're referring back to what's in the winery ordinance. But what I want to make sure is that there isn't a gathering, that this doesn't open the door to a gathering by private visitation only.
Chair Blau and Commissioner Brown, I think I'd like to ask the applicant to come up and clarify how many they're thinking they would have at a time for a private visitation. We do state in the project description there's no organized gatherings. They do have a 500 square foot, essentially it's a private tasting area within the winery that is allowed per the definition of a tasting room. It's not a public tasting room. It's a private area where you can have someone come in for to privately taste it as part of the wholesale marketing of, in this case, the spirits. But they are standing here at the podium, and if you would like, I think they could clarify their private visitation.
Please, if
for
you'd
us.
answer Commissioner Brown's question, we'd be eternally grateful.
Sure, yeah. Chairman Blau, Commissioner Brown, Marco Suput, owner of the property, with my wife Sarah. What we envision is sort of 1 to 4 people. If it'd be like restaurant owners, bartenders, hotel owners from the area that would carry the product, store owners, things like that, so that we could have tastings for them and to promote the product.
And it's also for education, as we're educating customers and wholesale customers on how the spirits are made, what our processes are. We just wanted to designate a spot for those meetings and for those conversations.
Well, I'm just wondering if we couldn't get some clarity about what you're intending, because it's not real clear here. It just says private visitation by appointment only. And from what you're describing, I don't have any problems with it. I just, having been on the commission a while and seeing the issues we've had with these private tastings that balloon into other things, that it would be, I think, important to clarify just exactly the extent of what you're planning in terms of total number of people and who these people are and when they're coming and so on and so forth.
Right. And we can work with Dana to clarify that.
Well, let me ask, could we just simply say anticipating 6 or less people at a time? Would that be fair to say, based on what you said earlier?
Yeah.
Would that satisfy Commissioner Brown? If we just had Dana add a description?
Well, I just want to make sure that there's not night gatherings that turn into dinners. And, you know, Commissioner Blau, we've been through all of this where we've seen all this stuff morph over time. And, you know, I hate to burden this applicant, but this is the reality of what we've dealt with. And so there's some, I hate to say, I greet it with some skepticism about the language here, and just wish for some more clarity about what's intended. So that in the future, if somebody says, oh, gee, they've had 20 people here, and I think that's a gathering, well, that's not what they intended. They intended something entirely different. So I personally would like to see something that's clearer and really is indicative of what they're going to do here, so that we have an understanding of that. And I don't think it's just private visitation by appointment only is sufficient. But that's my opinion. Maybe there's other commissioners who feel differently, but
I think Dana wants to weigh in here. Go ahead, Dana.
Thank you, Chairman Blau, Commissioner Brown. I think what might work is if we wrote into the project description something to the effect of private visitation would consist of a maximum of 6 people during the operating hours of the winery. The winery is open from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So the only time they could have people there would be during that time, if we wrote it that way.
Okay, and it would, since they're planning on limiting it to the trade, perhaps that could be part of it as well? Because here it just says private visitation by appointment only. It's not, doesn't really tell me who's coming. It might be a different animal if you have the trade rather than you just have somebody call up and say, gee, I'd like to come to your winery. And if that's, we can get the Supits to agree to that, something like that.
Can I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. You know, we're attempting to make this business our livelihood. And so there's no intention to be vague. We would just like to be able to have folks to come see what we're doing and what we're producing. We understand that those who've gone before us have maybe worked outside the limits, and so I certainly respect the need for clarity. We're comfortable adding this into the project description in terms of a size limit, as well as who's coming. You know, again, we want to work within the framework with what works. If down the road our business seems to be more, we'll come back to planning and see what else we can do. But I think for us to begin and to start, this would work for our business. And
Okay.
again,
Okay.
for what the county needs.
Okay, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from commissioners in the South? Are we done? Seeing no one respond, thank you. I'm going to ask for any public comment. Do we have any speaker slips? I don't see any, so I'll close that part of the hearing and come back. This is a 4th District item. Commissioner Farini, how do you wish to proceed?
Yes, I'm ready to move forward with the motion to approve after we've listened to everything, make sure Commissioner Brown is satisfied. But that was our intent at the last meeting, but I would like to move forward with the project.
Oh. Okay, well, I'm going to take that as a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
I have a second. Do we have any further discussion or concerns? Not hearing any. Mr. Villalobos, if you'll read the roll call.
All right.
And I think I'll help you here. So, Commissioner Farini, you are including your motion the modifications that we made after Commissioner Brown's comments and the ones that Edie added on the screen earlier.
So you're... Yes, correct.
Okay, great.
Commissioner Park.
Aye.
Commissioner Farini.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney.
Aye.
Chair Blau.
Aye.
Motion passes 5-0.
Okay. Do we, is Mr. Langle in Santa Barbara, or does he need time to set up, or is he here, or? He's here. We're going to
He's
take a
not
little.
here.
He's here, or he just did. We're going to take a little 5-minute break. Be back to you when we get set up for the next item. Thanks. Okay, wait, we're ready to go back on the record. Oh, I see Mr. Cooney's missing, so I'll wait a minute before he gets back.
That's how thirsty you are.
Okay. Almost ready. Thank you. Going back on the record, Mr. Vilbos, if we read the next item into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is a hearing on the request of the Planning and Development Department that the County Planning Commission recommend that the Board of Supervisors adopt ordinances case number 16 ORD 14 and 16, and with the proposed ordinance amendments revising existing development standards and permit procedures in order to implement recent state legislation regarding ADUs.
Thank you. Mr. Langle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. If we can get the PowerPoint on the screen. Okay, just by way of a little bit of background to take you back for the existing commissioners who were on the commission back in the summer of last year. In May 17th, 2017 and June 7th of 2017, the Montecito and County Planning Commissions did adopt recommendations to the Board of Supervisors regarding proposed amendments to the Montecito and the County Land Use and Development Codes, as well as Article 2 zoning ordinance. These amendments were presented to the Board of Supervisors on September 12th of that year, and at that hearing, the Board reviewed the recommendations of the County and Montecito Planning Commissions and directed staff to first return to the Board with revised ordinances addressing upcoming changes to state law in regards to accessory dwelling units, and to review the following areas of concern that the Board discussed during their hearing. First, the applicability of local regulations regarding septic systems, the location of ADUs on property relative to the principal dwelling, the scope of county actions required within the 120 days of application submittal, and lastly, the consistency of the land use permit process with the ministerial process requirement of the state statute. Just by way of refresher also, for ease of description of the different types of accessory dwelling units, we've divided them into two categories. Category A consists of the situation where the lot on which the accessory dwelling unit is proposed already contains an existing principal dwelling at the time of application, and that the development of the ADU is proposed to be located entirely within the existing principal dwelling or an existing accessory structure on the property. Category B ADUs are those where the lot may be vacant under the revised state law at the time of application for the ADU, provided that the concurrent construction of the principal dwelling is also proposed, and that the accessory dwelling unit would be located either within an addition to the principal dwelling, or in addition to an existing accessory building, or a new accessory building. In the previous amendments that we discussed with your commission, the proposal to allow ADUs was in a restricted set of zones, and that were those zones at that time that were more or less determined to be residential zones in nature, except for a couple of outliers, including the Ag 1 zone. However, with the revisions to state law, where it now provides that ADUs may be located in any zone in which a single family or multiple family dwelling is allowed, in order to comply with the state law, we have expanded the list of zones in which ADUs may be applied for, as shown on the screen. And these include now both agricultural zones, the Ag 1 and the Ag 2, the mountainous zones for Gaviota, Goleta, and Toro Canyon, the Resource Management Zone. In addition, for certain commercial zones, the C1 zone, light commercial, the commercial mixed zone for Los Alamos, the mixed use zone, just by way of comparison of the previous recommended standards, what is now proposed. In the former ordinances, your commission recommended that within the coastal zone, that review by the Historical Landmarks Advisory Commission would be allowed or required if the building is 50 years or older. And this was also the proposed recommendation for the non-coastal portions of the Montecito Community Plan area. In the inland area, the proposed standards was that the review would be required if the building was built prior to 1960. What we're now proposing is that all three ordinances be conformed to the same standard, which would be to change the inland area recommendation to conform to, again, the coastal zone and what Montecito proposed, that the review would be required if the building was 50 years or older. Under parking requirements, your recommendation in June of 2017 was that one additional space per bedroom would be required. And based on recent changes to state law, we are now proposing that only one space per ADU would be required. And again, please stop me if you have any questions as I go through the slides. It's usually easier to discuss it at that point.
I've got no lights on. Continue.
All right, thank you. Under the previous recommendation, as far as the permit required, your recommendation was that within the coastal zone, that a coastal development permit would be required, plus within the Ag 1 zone, a minor conditional use permit for detached ADUs, and within the Naples Townsite zone, that a major CUP would be required for all accessory dwelling units. Within the inland area, Category A, accessory dwelling units were proposed to require zoning clearance if they were not zoned for Ag 1 or NTS. Category B units would require a land use permit, again, if not zoned Ag 1 or NTS. And then within the Ag zone, an LUP if attached to the ADU, or a minor conditional use permit if detached. And within the NTS zone, consistent with the coastal zone, a conditional use permit for all accessory dwelling units. In response to recent state legislation, the new proposed standard is that in the coastal zone, a CDP be required for all accessory dwelling units. So deleting the requirement for either a minor CUP or a CUP. And similarly for the inland area, Category A would be a zoning clearance as previously recommended. And for Category B, only a land use permit, again, deleting the requirement for a minor or major conditional use permit. And this is required to implement the requirements of the state statute, section 65852.2, which requires that all permits for all applications for accessory dwelling units be reviewed on a ministerial basis without a public hearing. During the Board of Supervisors hearing on the proposed amendments back in September of last year, they did bring up a concern regarding our proposed requirement that a land use permit be required for Category B accessory dwelling units. This concern was in regards to the state law that requires a ministerial review process without a public hearing. And because land use permits are subject to appeal, and those appeals require a hearing, the board was concerned that this may not be consistent with the requirement of the state statute. The department's position that it is consistent to require a land use permit because the proposed ordinance does include restrictions on appeals that may be filed with the county, whereas the grounds for appeal would be limited to whether or not the project is consistent with the development standards. Also, that the appellant must identify how the approved project is inconsistent with standards if they do file an appeal, and that the department will not accept an appeal if the if the appellant fails to identify inconsistencies. Additionally, the initial review of the land use permit is done by staff on a strictly ministerial basis by comparing the application to the development standards in effect for the county. Another concern that the board discussed during their hearing was whether or not the requirement that in order to have a ADU based on a septic system, that there be a minimum lot area of 1 acre for every dwelling on the lot. And the concern was whether or not this requirement was consistent with state law, which provides that no other local ordinance shall be the basis for the denial of a building permit or use permit for an accessory dwelling unit. So in this case, if one were to apply for an accessory dwelling unit utilizing a septic system, there would have to be a 2 acre lot minimum for the lot in which it was proposed to be located in order to be consistent with the county standards for the use of private septic systems. The department's position is that this requirement is still a valid requirement, even with the restriction under the state statute, because the local agency management plan, or LAMP for short, implements the State Water Quality Control Board directive and requirements regarding septic systems, and that the state ADU law also requires approval by the Public Health Department.
I need to stop you there for a second. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because in most projects, the size of the septic system and the requirement for having an acre is somewhat dependent upon, or normally dependent on, the number of bathrooms and the number of plumbing fixtures that the project has. For example, a 5-bedroom house would not have the same minimal requirement that a 2-bedroom house would have. I know that septic systems are sized based on the number of plumbing fixtures. So why would they not look at this and determine that the existing septic system or an enhanced septic system would be able to handle the number of bathrooms and showers and other plumbing fixtures that are contained within the property?
Chairman Blau and members of the commission, you're correct in that when the Public Health Department is looking at a proposed septic system, the size of the system is based on the number of plumbing fixtures within the dwelling that the septic system will serve. However, in this particular instance, because of the language of the LAMP program, it does specify that regardless of the size of the structure involved, that each dwelling needs to have a lot area of 1 acre in order to rely on a private septic system.
Well, I'd be surprised if that holds up under state law, but we'll see. Go ahead, continue.
The board was also interested in the timing of the occupancy of the accessory dwelling unit relative to the principal dwelling on the property, and they were questioning whether or not the ADU should be able to build and be occupied prior to constructing the principal dwelling. The proposed standard that we've included within our proposed ordinances being reviewed today is that the principal dwelling, the final building permit inspection for the principal dwelling would need to occur prior to the final building inspection for the ADU, which would not allow then the ADU to be built and occupied prior to constructing the principal dwelling. The reason for this is that it prevents the owner from building the accessory dwelling unit subject to the relaxed development standards. For example, fewer parking spaces required, reduced impact fees that are required to be paid, and then letting the building permit lapse for the principal dwelling. If this were to occur, then the ADU would be the only dwelling on the property. It would become the principal dwelling and would be inconsistent with the zoning requirements that apply to that principal dwelling.
Mr. Park.
I have a question about that. I just want to understand how it works. You know, often folks will buy an agricultural property and build a unit above the barn or something that would be kind of what an ADU would look like, and then they're getting their funds together and whatever else it takes to build a principal residence. So under this, that barn apartment would be the principal residence, and then if they go to build the new principal residence, that'll be the ADU. I mean, will that prevent that kind of process from happening? My question makes sense to you?
Yes, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Park. Yes, I mean, what you've described is a situation that is fairly common where somebody builds a small residence on the property, they live in that residence, and then later on, when they secure the funds or whatever, they build a much larger residence and then convert the original residence to either in this case, possibly an accessory dwelling unit or to some other type of accessory structure, not always a dwelling. The difference between that situation and what we're discussing here, however, is that when it was originally built would be considered the principal dwelling at that time. And so they would have to provide all the standard requirements that a principal dwelling needs to provide at the time of construction. They would have to provide all the required parking, they would have to pay all the required impact fees, et cetera, and they would not be getting a break on those standards that they would if they were constructing an accessory dwelling unit.
But they would be able to later swap labels and have
Yes,
the
yes.
1,200 structure be the 1,200-foot structure be the ADU and the larger place be the principal. Great,
Right.
thank you.
At a later point in time, there is a process we have where the person can continue to live in that initial unit while they're constructing the new principal unit, and then the requirement is that following occupancy of the new principal unit, they then either modify the existing unit or do whatever is necessary to make it comply with the zoning ordinance. The board had a fair amount of discussion regarding the proposed amendments that laid out different standards for different parts of the county. And they seemed to be concerned especially with the fact that Montecito Planning Commission had recommended adding different standards for the Montecito planning area versus the what would apply to the remainder of the county. These standards include the following four, which we'll discuss in a little bit of detail. First, the Montecito Planning Commission included a standard that would require that an ADU shall not be located any closer to the principal abutting street than the principal dwelling unless other zoning provisions such as setback requirements would prohibit compliance with this requirement. And the board wondered whether or not this was really necessary. Also, the Montecito Planning Commission included a standard that the maximum lot coverage would be limited in that the total gross area of all buildings located on a lot, including the ADU, would not exceed 40% of the gross lot area. The Montecito Planning Commission also recommended different standards regarding the maximum size of the accessory dwelling unit. Your commission recommended just a straight 8% of the net lot area would determine the size of the accessory dwelling unit, whereas the Montecito Planning Commission stayed with their original recommendation that based the area of the accessory dwelling unit would be tied to the lot size of the lot that's located on per the chart shown on the screen above. And also the last thing that the Montecito Planning Commission recommended was that the use of parking lifts for replacement parking not be allowed within the Montecito planning area. And the discussion was whether or not this was directly in conflict with state law or not, and wanted the department to take a further look at that. So the proposed ordinances in front of you today do not include those four standards that we just discussed, as we are trying to make the standards as uniform as possible throughout the county. And just because the state legislature can't sit still when it comes to accessory dwelling units, there are a number of bills that have been introduced in this legislative session that would affect affordable housing, and two in particular would affect the accessory dwelling unit legislation. First, SB 831, introduced by Senator Wachowski in January of this year, provides the following changes to the existing statute. First would be that any floor to area ratio calculations shall not include the ADU floor area, that you cannot require owner occupancy of either the accessory dwelling unit or the principal dwelling, that if an ADU application is not deemed approved, or I'm sorry, is not acted on within 120 days, it's deemed approved, that replacement parking is not required if a garage is converted to an ADU, that the local jurisdiction may not charge any mitigation fees whatsoever for the accessory dwelling unit, and these would include development impact fees, school impact fees, and likewise for the different utility districts, they cannot charge any connection fees for an accessory dwelling unit. It does also restrict the application of current building codes and would say that the building code that applied when the structure that is being converted to an accessory dwelling unit, when it was built, that building code would be used to determine consistency with the current standards. And lastly, that it provides remedies to both the Housing and Community Development Department and private applicants if locally adopted ordinances do not comply with the state statute 65852.2, as would be revised by this piece of legislation. And that involves being able to file an action in court, and the court being able to assess fines against the local jurisdiction if they find that the jurisdiction does not comply with the statute. A second bill, Assembly Bill 2939, introduced by Assemblymember Ting in February of this year, speaks to developments that are multifamily in nature, and says that would say, if it approved, that a building permit shall be ministerially approved to create at least one accessory dwelling unit in a multifamily structure that contains at least 5 residential units under this following situation. First, that the ADU is located within the existing structure or an accessory structure, that the lot is zoned for multifamily use, independent access to the ADU is provided, that the setbacks are sufficient for fire and safety purposes, and lastly, that the approval may not be conditioned to limit the number of ADUs created within that existing multifamily structure.
I have a question for you there. I'm just a little confused by that. So I'm allowed one ADU for every 5 units in the multifamily, or what? I'm not certain how they, I mean, if you have a 40-unit apartment complex, how many ADUs can I put in there?
It's up to the local jurisdiction, but what the law would say that we would have to approve at least one.
Okay. So it's one per parcel is what you're telling me.
We could allow one for every 5 units or just one per lot. Again, it would depend on what the local jurisdiction proposed.
So what are we proposing to the board now?
Under this legislation has just been introduced, so it's not law at this point, and presently our ordinances do not include any language to this effect.
Okay.
What the ordinances, I'm sorry, the proposed ordinance do affect the multifamily zones, and what it says currently is that at one ADU would be allowed per lot within those zones.
Okay.
So our recommendation to you today is to follow the recommendations in Section 2 of the staff report, to adopt the findings for approval, determine that the project is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act. For the County Land Use and Development Code, adopt a resolution recommending that the board approve the proposed ordinance. And similarly, for Article 2, also adopt a resolution recommending that the board approve the proposed ordinance.
And one further question, is our proposal to limit this to where one of the units has to be owner occupied, or we're not doing that? I know some of the municipality districts around us are doing that. I think it's going to be knocked down, but I'm just wondering, what are we doing now for the board?
The recommendation adopted by your commission last June was to include that requirement for owner occupancy, and that is part of the proposed standard in what you're reviewing today. But as you noted, it may be declared invalid if the legislation gets adopted as proposed.
Right. Oops. Any questions from commissioners?
Just one last thing. We will be going to the board of supervisors. The date is not yet determined. The board also directed that we submit our ordinances to the California Housing and Community Development Department to review prior to returning to the board. We have done that. Essentially, I did that in February after your commission continued this hearing. We have not heard back from state HCD, and we hope to hear soon so we can proceed on to the board. That concludes my presentation and perhaps my final presentation to the Planning Commission.
Thank you. Commissioners in the South, do we have any questions for Mr. Langle? Commissioner Brown?
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Fair enough. Mr. Park, did you have a question? Go ahead.
I do, but first I have a question for you, Chairman Blau. Are we supposed to be making ex parte disclosures of contacts on an ordinance matter like this?
Actually, this is a legislative matter, so if you're welcome to, but you're not required to.
Okay, well, I'm going to anyway.
Fine.
Just because I think it illuminates some of my concerns. This will be a long list. I met with the Land Use Planning Committee of the Cattlemen's Association and associated agricultural groups. I met with the board of We Watch. I spoke at length with former Planning Commissioner, 4th District Planning Commissioner Michael Benedict, a winemaker, and also with Joe Cole, Chairman of the Montecito Planning Commission. And this was all about location of ADUs. But I have two other questions I'd like to ask first because they're easier. On owner occupancy, that requirement, I guess this would be a question of Ms. Hartley. How confident are we that will survive state scrutiny? It seems like we're on thin ice by requiring owner occupancy with a state law that's designed to increase the housing.
So, Chair and Commissioners, currently Government Code Section 65852.2 let me see.
Where is it?
It's in here somewhere.
It does
allow. A6 allows counties, if they adopt their own ordinances, to include in there a provision in regards to owner occupancy requirements, or that the property be used for rentals of terms longer than 30 days. So currently there is statutory authority for your commission to recommend that that be a requirement. There is pending legislation, as Mr. Lingle referred to, in SB 831 that would remove that requirement, but that has not yet been acted on by the state legislature or approved by the governor. So there is a potential in the future that that may not be a valid requirement, but at the current time that is a valid requirement allowed by law.
Well, let me move on then, unless other commissioners want to ask about that subject.
Well, no, but I'll weigh in on it just for the fun of it. I'm pretty confident that this is going to get knocked down, and I think it should get knocked down. And the reason that it bothers me so much is what do you do with an owner who builds his property, then builds an ADU, and then for job reasons or whatever is forced to leave, and they don't wish to sell the property, they wish to rent it. Maybe it's a temporary job assignment for a year or two, and they want to come back to their residence. Are we going to require them to knock the AD, destroy the AD, remove from the property? So what's the remedy going to be by the county or the city when they determine that the primary residence is no longer being used as a primary residence, is using as rental, and so is the ADU? What is the penalty? What is the remedy?
Mr. Chair, members of the County Planning Commission, this was a point of discussion back in June, and the ordinances as written today do provide that the director may allow the owner to not occupy the property for extended periods of time based on the situation that you described, where they're on sabbatical or they're taking a job out of the area, with the expectation is that they will return to the area and reoccupy the dwelling. So we feel that that is accounted for in our present language.
Commissioner Parks, continue.
Yes, I join in Chairman Blau's concern, and I'll just pose another hypothetical that I run into a lot in my practice of law, in that an elderly person occupies the main house. You might have an ADU, and that's perfectly appropriate there. There might be a caretaker living that, or other children of the elderly person. Elderly person passes on. Now a trustee owns it. The trustee doesn't occupy it, can't occupy it. And you have a situation where it might pay for a few years to rent out the main house and also continue with the ADU. And it provides for a tricky situation under this ordinance requiring owner occupancy. I think we would simplify things by getting rid of that requirement personally.
Do you want to continue other points, or do you want to?
I do, unless other commissioners want to weigh in. I would next turn to the HLAC review portion. And I don't know if that's something where you want to return to a slide or staff report. And maybe while you're setting that up, I can express my concern there. I was on HLAC for a short period of time. It's the number of nominations that HLAC receives are probably well under half a dozen a year. It's probably more like 3 a year, okay? So it might be reviewing 3 new structures, okay? They're obviously not new structures, but they're new to HLAC, all right? With all the ADU applications we're going to see, that means that every tract house built in the 50s, like the one I was basically born in, are going to require review by HLAC. It will tremendously increase their workload, I would think. And I don't think we've heard from HLAC about this. And I also have a concern that HLAC review, that kind of seems to deviate from the requirement that the reviews here be ministerial. So my suggestion is that we have, since we'll have staff reviewing each application instead, that they review each project, under certain guidelines, well-specified guidelines for historical significance, that the staff determines if there's historical significance, and if it is, then refer it to HLAC. But do something like that, then automatically referring every structure built prior to 1960 to HLAC when an ADU is proposed. I'm just so concerned about the workload for everyone if we do that.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Park, the review by HLAC is advisory only and does not have any bearing on whether or not the application for the ADU would be approved or not. It was felt to be appropriate by the Planning Commissions in regards to if it did potentially involve a historical structure, that the review would be beneficial to the applicant in knowing exactly what they were dealing with, and then could take advantage of that review and perhaps modify their project if they so desired to prevent any impacts to historical resources. However, understanding your point in regards to the volume of activity that might occur, we could put language into the ordinance that provides similarly to what we have as in existing language for the demolition of potentially historic structures, is that the review by the Historical Landmarks Advisory Commission shall not be required if the director has determined that the structure is not historically significant. And this would cut out a lot of the situations that you're concerned about, where you have a tract house that was built in 1962 and suddenly is, just because of the language of the ordinance would require the HLAC actually review that particular application.
I think that would be an excellent modification. Shall I move on?
Continue.
Okay. As Mr. Langle knows, I have a real concern with location. We had an excellent meeting about that sort of diverged into our mutual interest in railroads, but we covered a lot on location of ADUs. And it's an issue that all the different groups I spoke with are concerned about. And the basic concern is that we can't really have a one-size-fits-all solution for location of ADUs on all lot sizes. In the smaller suburban lots that are in the Goleta part of my district and in Commissioner Brown's district, just where the ADU is located doesn't matter that much. There's only so much room in those lots, and there are going to be setback requirements and so forth. These ADUs will probably wind up in backyards and things, so it's not a major concern there. In large agricultural parcels, large Ag 2 parcels, might be 1,000 acres, 300 acres. It doesn't much matter where the ADU is located to the neighbors. It does matter to those property owners, because what I hear is that most farmers and ranchers don't want a requirement of clustering the ADUs with their main houses. They might need them in other locations for practical reasons, and I understand that. So, but I do believe that in these intermediate-sized parcels, and I chose 2 acres to 20, or it might be 1 to 10, whatever, it makes a lot of difference. In many of these parcels, my neighborhood of 5-acre parcels, the houses are generally in the middle of the lots. That's kind of how they're organized. But if we have no restrictions on where ADUs are located, then the only thing that will determine how close they can be to their neighbors are the setback requirements, which the way a lot of these properties are organized might just be side yard setbacks and rear yard setbacks, which are minimal. I'm not registering a complaint about my neighbor, but my neighbor put in a legal RSU that is much closer to my house. In fact, it's right out my kitchen window than it is to the neighbor's, to her own house. And there's the driveway, and I now have a quiet neighborhood I moved into 20 years ago. I now have a rental parked right outside my front door. And I don't appreciate that. I would imagine that other people in that situation would not appreciate it. And that's kind of what I heard from people that I spoke with. And I also believe that we should try to have the most uniform policies throughout the county as we can, notwithstanding the Montecito Planning Commission's recommendations. And I think what this proposed ordinance does is essentially ignores the Montecito Planning Commission recommendations. I understand the reasoning there, but I tried to come up with something that adopts some uniform standards throughout the county and does accommodate the Montecito Planning Commission recommendations. So that's been put on the screen. Thank you for doing that. I'll explain what I'm suggesting there is that for parcels under 2 acres, then we do essentially what the Montecito Planning Commission recommended. In fact, that's the exact language, that the ADU could not be located any closer to the principal abutting street than the principal dwelling, unless zoning provisions such as setback requirements would prohibit compliance with that requirement. I think that can work throughout the whole county. But for these intermediate parcels that I'm concerned about, I chose 2 acres up to 20, but somebody might say 1 to 10 or 2 to 10. I don't know. Best I could come up with is that an ADU should not be located any closer to any boundary line, this is to protect the neighbors, than the lesser of 100 feet or the distance from the principal dwelling to that boundary line. So if the boundary line for the principal dwelling is closer to the boundary line than 100 feet, well then so can the ADU. And then for parcels in excess of 20 acres, the ADU could be located anywhere subject to the building envelope requirements we might have under the uniform rules if it's an ag preserve, or to just typical setback requirements. So this is what I would suggest to modify the draft ADU ordinance. Do you think that this can work, Mr. Langel?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Park, yes, you can certainly include this in your recommendation. If you do, as part of your action letter, and I would probably modify the language somewhat to more conform to what the existing development code language provides for. We would probably also recommend that you put some language similar to the last part of 1 in 2 as well, just to accommodate any particular situation that might occur where even on parcels of that size, it's not feasible really to locate it in that manner because of the existing development of the property or where the existing agricultural fields are located, things of that nature. It would just give an escape valve for those specific situations.
So can you do all this before you retire?
Yes.
Thank you.
Are we done?
I am. Sorry it took so long.
Okay. Any comments from South County or questions? Not seeing any. I do have some public speakers. I think I have none in Santa Maria. I think they're all in Santa Barbara. Is there one here? Oh, the last one? Gotcha. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. The little slip, sure. First, we'll go to Everett Woody.
Commissioner Blau, members of the commission. I just want to respond to one comment about the owner occupancy that was just mentioned by someone with the county, where they were reciting the state statute. And the state statute indicates that a local agency may require an applicant for a building permit issued in pursuant to this subdivision to be an owner occupant, or that the property be used for rentals in terms longer than 30 days. The county has already decided on short-term rentals. They've already selected the short-term rental aspect of that. The statute says owner occupancy or, so it's one or the other. So I disagree with that, the county's representative with regards to that. My main point today is to discuss the county's proposed ordinance that states on the first page, it says, required by the government code, section 65852.2, an accessory dwelling unit shall be A, deemed to be an accessory use or an accessory building. Now, in the past, when we approved accessory buildings as pool cabanas or whatnot, the purview of the EHS was to make the determination predicated upon percolation tests, size of the septic tank based on California Plumbing Code calculations, and a survey of the existing septic system if it exists. So I think that in item 2 of the proposed ordinance, it states wastewater, the public sewer service is not available. The accessory dwelling unit may be served by a wastewater treatment system subject to review or approval by the public health department. I think that we should enumerate what the environmental health powers are. I don't believe that the state law enumerates powers to EHS to allow them to deny the project based upon a LAMP ordinance. The LAMP is an ordinance, and the state law specifically states that if you have an existing ordinance in place, that you may not deny the ADU. Now, you know, with regards to any part of the county's ordinance, the state law enumerates the powers specifically. It allows them to determine the size, to make the determination of life safety and location on the property for denial. Those are the only 3 places that the government code allows for denial. So to simply grant EHS the power to deny an accessory building predicated upon the lot size seems contrary to the state law. Now, I'll go back to the beginning of the county's ordinance, where it says to be deemed an accessory use or accessory building. Now, in the EHS's past position, it says an ADU is a de facto lot split. That means that EHS is redefining the word accessory and calling the accessory building a separate address, a separate building located on the same property, which it's not, and it says so in your own ordinance by definition. So I request that you guys deny this ordinance and request that you send it back to the public for more input, maybe from the AIA and so forth. I also want to note that probably about 6 months ago, I did have a conversation regarding this with Noel Langle, and I requested that he have a conversation with HCD regarding this, because HCD took the position that you could not deny the project or require an additional septic system. At that time, he declined to have that conversation with HCD. So again, I request that you ask staff to enumerate the powers of HCD and restrict his review to percolation, size of tank, and survey of the existing system. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And now I have Allison, and I really can't read the last name, M-A-R-C, I believe.
Good morning, Chair Blau and Commissioners. My name is Allison Marsalak. I'm the Executive Director of the Montecito Association. The Chair of our Land Use Committee, Corey Heyman, could not be here today, so I'm representing the Montecito Association for her. The Montecito Association respectfully requests that this commission adopt the Montecito Planning Commission recommendation. The Montecito Association also may have additional recommendations as the rebuild and recovery process continues. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Valerie Frostex.
Hello, Chair Blau and members of the Commission. My name is Valerie Froscher. I'm a 40-year resident of the county, architect, member of the AIA, longtime member of the South Coast Board of Architectural Review. I've also been very involved with the City of Santa Barbara in terms of the accessory dwelling unit state law. And I feel very strongly that it is important to embrace the ADU concept and to find ways to make it simpler and more available to the public. It's a great solution for low-density housing, and I believe that there are still far too many limitations that will have unintended consequences in prohibiting applications from the public. I don't think I have time to go over all of them. I know we had submitted a letter from the AIA back in January that had a list of items, and most of those items are still applicable as areas of concern. I agree that septic systems should not follow the 2-acre minimum for prohibiting ADUs. I feel that special problems areas should be able to be looked at in terms of individual site characteristics. And I believe that's been implemented to some degree in the draft, but it's very important that it be a case-by-case basis and not a prohibition. We support that there be a zoning clearance, a very simple zoning clearance, not a coastal development permit. And in order to adhere to the ministerial aspect of the state law, it's important, and that would be true with design review as well. I know there was a recommendation to have the chair of, that cannot happen. Instead, we should work toward a good design checklist that everybody can follow. In terms of the ADU not being allowed in front of the main property or main house, I think that's problematic. I understand your concern of someone building right next to your main house on a medium-sized lot, but there are so many characteristics of different lots in that medium size, 2 to 20 acres, that would be prohibited to apply for an ADU if it's not allowed to be in front of the main residence and to follow the setbacks. So I think that's something that needs more work. The 120-day review, hopefully that's been worked out, that the clock starts and stops when that's it. Well, you can see there's a lot. Thank you.
I had a question for you.
Uh-huh.
You talked about a good design checklist. Did you have like a rough draft of something?
We've worked on some at the city, and certainly we could work on something as AIA, and Alex Peugeot is also on the South Board of Architectural Review with me. We have a lot of experience in design review, and we'd be happy to work on something like that.
Mr. Chair, if I just may ask Ms. Brasher this question. You don't think that our very sort of simple guidelines are enough? We need more? I think what we came up with were pretty good. Got to match.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I like that.
It should be simple.
Yes, I think it's fairly simple, straightforward. Okay. I'm a design person like you guys are, and I think it's okay. I think most of these are probably going to be within the existing dwelling anyway, certainly on the South Coast, I'm thinking. Maybe your experience is different.
Well, there's bigger properties where I think they'll be detached.
They may be, but, and if they'll probably be in the backyard and they're outside of sort of the public view shed or the streetscape, it probably doesn't make too much difference, I'm thinking. So I'm thinking what we have, and I would, if you just go back and take a look at that, I think the language is okay.
Okay. Yeah, well, the thing in the county is there's a huge variety of properties.
Well, that's
there's
the problem.
Everything from bigger agricultural
Right.
to very suburban to
Right.
small tract houses.
And what we're trying to do here is one size fits all, and as you know, it's very difficult.
Yeah,
So.
but my main comment was toward not having the chair of any.
No,
board
that's
reviewing.
not it's not embedded. That's not in there. So.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Peugeot?
Good morning, Chair Blau, Commissioners. I'm Alex Peugeot. I agree with exactly with every single comment that Valerie Froscher made before me. I think we're all in support of ADUs because they are the easiest, simplest, more comprehensive approach to housing, at least in the South Coast. It's the easiest way to get housing on the ground, faster, cheaper, with less impacts to the environment, just about minimum impacts to the infrastructure with no government assistance. So we're working for the removal of as many barriers as possible in compliance with state law and beyond that. You don't have to be limited by the state law. As such, I would like to put my 2 bits towards the removal of the LUP requirement for some units. What does it take? Well, 3-4 weeks to get an intake appointment, $1,800, and at the end, you get exactly the same result. So you can save yourself some time doing that. The legality of an LUP process can also be questioned, and it probably will. So why don't you just save some time, simplify, keep things simple. The land use clearance will certainly do. Also, I'm concerned about the blanket prohibition in Mission Canyon. Mission Canyon is a very large special problems area, defined as such. If you probably remember 50 years ago when the county and the city made a joint program to put sewer in that area. And well, the designation continues, and you're putting together a series of properties that are completely different in nature from the ones that are in Los Padres National Forest, up until properties that are right next to the city grid. And some have wide roads, some have narrow roads, some have hazards, some do not. And you cannot just exclude all of them just because you are commissioners. You are supposed to make findings. And you cannot make a blanket finding covering the whole area as such. You can cover some aspects or some characteristics of certain lot. Finally, I would like you to ask staff to send the public comment letters to HCD as well with the draft ordinance, if that is possible. And I agree with the comments made about HLAC and owner occupancy. And one last thing about FARs in Summerland. If you look at the numbers, they are very, 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 very tight, to the point that will they prohibit some units in the Summerland area if you look at the lower numbers. I'm not too concerned, because if you read SB 831, the FARs and owner occupancy will probably be removed on January 1st. But you may want to take a look and save yourself, again, some trouble. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Susan Belloni.
Hi, Chairman and Commissioners and staff. My name is Susan Bellany. I'm here representing WeWatch. Our president, Nancy Emerson, couldn't be here, so I'm going to read her statement from WeWatch. After a beginning review of available information regarding ADU development standards, we encourage you to adopt consistent countywide standards where possible. Given some of the uncertainties surrounding the state regulations, we would advise you to take the time necessary for you and the community to do our best to avoid unintended consequences. We think these questions need to be considered, and there are 6 questions here. Would it be possible to at least encourage clustering on larger properties? ADUs could be clustered with existing owner-occupied residential structures or with employee housing. It would be environmentally helpful and cost-effective. Number 2, the ADU requirements seem to place very few limitations on location of the ADUs on a lot, and what might be the unintended consequences of this, e.g., building an ADU in front of existing residents so it is between it and principal abutting street. Please do what you can to avoid destroying neighborhoods' attractiveness. Number 3, will the county be using the state's language regarding minimum rental period, which is longer than 30 consecutive days? We hope doing so may help prevent use of ADUs as a short-term vacation rental. Number 4, are sophisticated wastewater treatment systems now available that do not require septic fields? And if so, might exceptions to current lot size requirements be considered? Number 5, if a local agency can establish minimum and maximum size requirements, how may those affect environmentally friendly housing such as tiny houses, which are typically 100 to 400 square feet? The last question, are there ways the state and county can regulate to obtain initial and continued affordability for ADUs? Thank you, Nancy Emerson. If there's some time, I had a few of my own comments that are just me and not WeWatch, just individually. I hope the new ADU laws do help with California's affordability crisis, but I also gave some thought to possible unintended consequences. The first thing you realize is that they create random multifamily zoning and single-family zoning and every other zoning where people live. I could be wrong, but I think that single-family residential zoning will be a misnomer. There will be no way to know when or where the ADUs will be built in your neighborhood and which neighborhoods will become more dense and which will not. I've seen it called stealth density. Then you wonder if they really will be affordable and what has happened in other cities who have them. A California state website calls ADUs, quote, naturally affordable because people currently rent them to family and friends for no or reduced rents. That will help families who have the $150,000 or so to build one. However, I've heard that the owner occupancy rule is next in line to be changed, and if that happens and investors buy those properties, the rents will go up, and those properties will have to become even more expensive to buy when they are sold. In Vancouver, where they've had them for many years, a builder said that partly because they are not so scalable, ADUs are not as cheap as you would think to build, and they're highly desirable because people would prefer to live in someone's new guest house with a garden view rather than a high-rise with people above and below them and maybe a parking lot view. I'm not against ADUs, but I would be very cautious about them, thinking they're going to be naturally affordable. Lastly, I really wanted personally to find out about the population growth because we all hear that people are leaving California, and apparently it's true. In the last 10 years or so, about 1 million people have left. And the birth rate is, although keeping the rate of growth at 0.7% annually, so we're still growing, but I think affordability is the big crisis. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Andy Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. I'm Andy Mills, and I'm with the Santa Barbara County Cattlemen's Association. Our association supports the ADU. We support the staff report. This is the best chance we've had for intergenerational housing that we've been asking for years. And intergenerational housing is going to be an important factor to sustaining our viability, particularly now in these periods where we're looking at possible prolonged periods of drought and a flood and drought cycle. We will be asking for more compatible uses, but having another generation on the family ranch is critical to us. I just want to say that most of our members have parcels on Ag 2 lands, and 95% of those are in Williamson Act contracts. There is no provision that has been suggested yet to update the uniform rules for Williamson Act contracts to accommodate the ADU. So I don't know if you could classify the ADU as an ag accessory structure, or you could undertake an update of the uniform rules to accommodate the ADU. So I'll leave that to the experts, but I just wanted to reiterate how important this is to us, and thanks to staff for writing an ordinance that is not excluding us, with the exception of the Williamson Act problem. Thank you.
Mr. Park, I may have a question.
I had
for
a
you.
couple of questions for Mr. Mills.
Absolutely.
That's a good point about the uniform rules. Right now, with these ag preserve properties, we've got a 2-acre building envelope, right? And so what you're suggesting is for these larger parcels, it might be good to redesign that part that limits it to 2-acre building envelopes, so somebody might have that ADU in a very different part of the property.
Well, remote siting would be very important to us, and if there was a way within the update of the uniform rules to accomplish some flexibility, that would be very important.
Well, and could you explain briefly why the remote siting would be useful to the ranchers and farmers?
Sure. Basically for security, some privacy issues, but mainly for security. If you had your kids living on part of the property that was set away from the main house, they could watch over that part of the property. Most of these ranches that our members have are large, so having an extra set of eyes and ears on a more remote part of the property would be of huge benefit to us. We would have to accommodate that in the uniform rule update as well, but there are probably some ways we could accomplish that. I appreciate the question.
Well, one last question for you. Maybe you won't appreciate this, but on the intergenerational housing, I'm very attuned to that because that's kind of how my family grew up. In the do the members of your association see a problem with the size limit of 1,200 square feet for ADUs if it's meant to be this intergenerational housing?
1,200 square feet is small for a family, but I think it's our feeling that if we drifted from the statute, we might be, and the mandates of that statute, we might be opening a can of worms.
Got it. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I have no more speakers for Santa Maria. Is there any other speakers in Santa Barbara? Seeing
no more speakers here.
No more speakers here. Great. Then I will close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission. Does staff have any comments on the public comment?
Sorry, Commissioner Blau. We do not have any comments to the comments we heard just now during the public testimony. Before you do take action, though, I do have one correction I would like to make to the ordinance, the attachment C as presented.
Please
And
do.
if I can do that now. What I've passed out is a replacement page for the ordinance, and it shows the inclusion in the section that deals with the height limitations on the proposed units. This was language that I inadvertently did not carry forward from the last round of ordinance amendments. This was in the what your commission saw back in June and what the board saw, and as I was revising the ordinances, I deleted it by mistake. Anyway, so the correction is to reinsert subsection III, shown as highlighted on the page I just passed out, that deals with when you have an accessory dwelling unit that's stacked with another accessory structure, that the overall height limit is limited to 25 feet. And again, this is just consistent with the previous ordinances that your commission reviewed previously.
Okay, I'm going to go. First, I'd like to poll my South County commissioners on the suggested modification by Commissioner Parks for the, I guess we'd call it the setbacks or the location. You all have a copy of his 3-paragraph suggested changes. So I'd like to see if we could get consensus on that, and I'm guessing that Mr. Lango is going to modify it slightly, adding some opt-out provisions for those unusual parcels, giving the director the authority to make the modification, and I think Commissioner Park is okay with that modification.
And what I presented is just conceptual. I knew that it would need to be revised into.
So if I could hear from South County Commissioners to give Mr. Langle the go-ahead to make those changes.
I'm fine with it.
I'm fine with it as well.
Okay with me.
Yeah.
Okay, great. The other one that I want to poll everybody on is this issue of the having to have another acre of ground for the septic system on a accessory dwelling unit. I personally don't find the need for that. I mean, if the Environmental Health Services makes the determination that the existing sewer system or septic system, or one that could be modified, enlarged, or changed, is adequate to service both the primary residence and the ADU, and I think we should be doing that. I mean, to do otherwise is just simply trying to place this enormous burden, and I think it just flies in the face of what the legislature is trying to do. So I'll ask my fellow commissioners their thoughts on that.
Mr. Chair, I just have a question for staff. Based upon what Mr. Langle has written here, it appears to be that it would be that it's the State Water Quality Control Board that we would be going against, that this is in fact a valid restriction. So I'm not really supportive of what you want to do. I think there needs to be some clarity made, and maybe it needs to be done by the state or through the regional the State Water Quality Control Board to kind of, if there's some disparity, to have them figure that out. But that's how I read it.
Mr. Chair, just one point of clarification. Commissioner Brown is correct. This requirement stems from the State Water Quality Control Board in their review and approval of our local septic system program. Also, I would point out that the ordinance before you does not have any minimum lot size requirement for any accessory dwelling units that are based on septic system. It only requires that where public sewer service is not available, the accessory dwelling unit may be served by an on-site wastewater treatment system subject to review and approval by the Public Health Department. So there was no mention of that 1 acre minimum lot size requirement per dwelling.
Okay, then I misunderstood your earlier comment then. I thought you said that there had to be another acre of ground in order for the accessory dwelling unit. If you have an acre now and you have a septic system there, you would have to have another acre to put the accessory dwelling unit to put another sewer in there. Did I miss something?
Mr. Chair, and perhaps it was my the way I discussed the matter with your commission. The Board of Supervisors brought up this area of concern based on public testimony at that time, similar to, I believe, Mr. Woody testified to the board as well, in regards to the county public health department requiring for any dwelling to be located on a piece of property that was to be served by a private septic system, that you had to have a minimum of 1 acre for each dwelling. So this pertains to both the principal dwelling unit on the property, any other additional dwellings, including farm worker dwellings, or it would also apply to an accessory dwelling unit. So this regulation is one that the Public Health Department imposes. It's not part of our particular accessory dwelling unit ordinances, however.
All right. Great. The only other question I have is we did receive a letter from John Lingenfelder talking about where he has a studio on top of, I think, a garage that he wanted to convert to an accessory dwelling unit, and was told by staff that he could not do that. Could someone explain to me why? It seems to me it's not consistent with what we're trying to do here. Maybe I don't understand the problem in Mission Canyon.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, the Mission Canyon Community Plan, which the ordinances in front of you today do not modify, contains a policy regarding second units, and basically says that second units shall be prohibited within the Mission Canyon Plan area unless the project application involves 2 contiguous legal lots under one ownership, at least one of which is vacant. The owner has merged the 2 contiguous lots prior to the issuance of the final building permit for the second unit. And lastly, that the vacant lot is otherwise residentially developable. So that is it's not the second unit zoning standards that the person is coming up against. It's the existing policy within the Mission Canyon Community Plan. And this policy was developed as a result of another policy within the Mission Canyon Community Plan, which says that the county shall recognize that the Mission Canyon Plan area is a constrained community with respect to fire hazard, parking and circulation, flooding and drainage, wastewater and geology, and hillsides and topography, and shall require that future development is adequately served by existing services and infrastructure. And based on those constraints, they then develop the second policy that restricts the development of a second unit to those situations that I described.
So my question would then follow, why could not the Montecito area do the same thing and effectively prohibit second units? I mean, we just went through the flood and the fires and everything else, and why could you not have that same policy in Montecito and not violate state law?
If the Montecito Community Plan went through the rigorous review that the Mission Canyon Community Plan did, and identified that those constraints to development should restrict the development of accessory dwelling units, then that is one thing that could be pursued. But it's not something that we're proposing at this time.
Okay, you answered my question, so I think we're at some risk there, but maybe not. Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Commissioner Blau. I wanted to speak on this issue, and it's probably appropriate here. I really question whether the county would have discretion on an individual application for an ADU, no matter where it's situated. As I'm most familiar with the Montecito area, and extending south in the foothills all the way through Carpinteria. But there are definite concerns with access to some of these parcels that we lived out during the recent fire, the Thomas fire. What discretion would staff have to limit the construction of an additional unit, bringing in additional residents to these areas? It's not the same as adding ADUs in the city of Santa Barbara or other areas which are built out and developed, but it's a major concern. And in the recommendations of the Montecito residents that have looked at this, number one, they asked for and received from this commission more time to just deal with these kinds of concerns than they had. And we can't delay at this point, I understand, but I am concerned that we have some ability at the staff level to deal with parcels that have public safety concerns, and nobody would doubt that they're there. I think Mr. Langle just said staff is not proposing to limit ADUs according to their location in high fire danger areas. So that's my concern and how we address it here today.
I'll just pipe in and say I agree with you. I have that same concern. It's like, it is a concern that the state is mandating that we do things that aren't in the public's best interest when it comes to roadway access and fire access and the rest of it. Lastly, I do want to poll the commission. I'm not in favor of the idea that we require owner occupancy whether the state changes the rules or not, for the reasons that I expressed before, and agreeing with Commissioner Parks. I think it's inappropriate to require that. I think it's going to be impossible to adequately monitor it and have remedies for it. I mean, you're really going to try, I mean, I just don't get it. I like Commissioner Parks' comment where, you know, so what part of an estate? It might take 10 years to settle the estate. I mean, I've seen families where the kids spend their entire inheritance with lawyers fighting over what they're going to do with the property. So what do we do with the rental in the interim? I'd like to see that provision taken out. I think it doesn't have any benefit. It's just another way we don't serve the public well. So I'm interested in hearing from the South County Commissioners on the issue of requiring owner occupancy of one of the units.
Well, I'll go first, but I also have something else to follow on. I don't think we should do it at this time. It wasn't something that was in our staff report. It wasn't something that we had anticipated. I think you might have had other additional people here if that had been in there. And if the state's going to act soon, I don't know what this legislation, when this legislation is proposed to go forward. I think we should just wait and see what happens. That's my personal opinion. But what I would like to ask, if I may, the question as a follow-on to Commissioner Cooney about the proposal to allow ADUs in the resource protection zones, based on his same concern about infrastructure and constrained infrastructure, and I see that we've allowed it in the Toro Canyon resource protection zone and Goleta Gaviota as well. And having been back on some of those properties back there, well, we saw one fairly recently, I think last year. I just, accessing some of these sites, it's not someplace I'd like to live, quite frankly. It's a beautiful place, but to get to them is very difficult. And I'm just thinking that here we have an opportunity not to allow additional development in these high fire hazard areas. You know, Gaviota has had the Whittier, the Sherper, the Ray. Goleta's had the Gap fire. We know what's gone on in Toro Canyon here lately. I just don't think we should be allowing additional development. I'm sorry. I think there's just a lot of hazards for a lot of people, and that would be my concern about the proposal to allow more development in that area.
I would agree with Commissioner Brown on that. It just seems that the state is putting us in a very tenuous position here to throw all caution to the wind and double density in communities that can't handle the density they have. So I don't know if there's a way we can look at that further and come back. I don't have the solution, but I do echo that thought. So, and then on the other one, the owner occupied, though I don't want to see all neighborhoods become rental hoods, here again, because of the way the state has fashioned the legislation, I don't see a way around it. You know, these things are going to evolve, and we would be wasting a lot of time and effort, I think, by trying to say it was owner occupied. So I would be in favor of taking that requirement out.
Commissioner Blau, I don't think I've spoken on this issue. I do share concerns of my fellow commissioners about requiring owner occupancy. I think my legal opinion is interfering with my heart on this. I just don't think it's going to stand up, and there may be a lot of change to proposed legislation, but my feeling is this is not going to change, and it will disappear. And I think we owe it to the Board of Supervisors to recommend that we're not supportive of that particular provision. I feel much differently about requiring the rental agreements for ADUs to exceed 30 days because we spent so much time on the short-term rental issue. I wouldn't want to see that disappear, but our proposed ordinances recognize that. So I think that's a different consideration. But, you know, in general with this ordinance, what we're trying to do is virtually impossible, and I salute Mr. Langle for trying to take the state law, the direction of the Board of Supervisors, and really increase density in a very open fashion for all parcels, and there's just no individual discretion allowed for situations which don't justify that additional density. So I think it's impossible to satisfy everybody on this, and you know, we either have to push this along to the board and wish Mr. Langle a happy retirement, or raise some objection, and I do intend to object to the ordinance for not recognizing the special problems areas in terms of health and safety.
I'll just comment on the short-term rentals. I think I heard council tell us that the current state law is that we have the ability to restrict the ADUs to not include less than 30-day rentals. In other words, we have the right to restrict the ADUs so that they cannot be used for short-term rentals. And she was also saying that we currently have the right, I think, to require owner occupancy of one of the units, but as I think we, at least four of us agree, that's not an appropriate suggestion that we take to the board. We should tell the board that it's the commission's position that they not require either building to be owner occupied. But I think you're right. Currently there is no short-term rental, and the state law would allow us to restrict that, even if we didn't restrict other short-term rentals. I think they were saying that ADUs could not be. We have the right to say they can't be used for short-term rentals. So I don't think we're disagreeing there. So I guess, Mr. Parks.
I have a question. And this is to follow up on what Commissioner Cooney just discussed, and Commissioner Brown and Commissioner Farini, and it's probably presumptuous for me to try to summarize all that, but I think the point was that ADUs should not be permitted in these high hazard zones. So I just have a question for Ms. Hartley. Can we do that under the state law? Can we exclude them from these, what I'm calling high hazard zones? Maybe there's a better phrase for it.
So, Chair and Commissioners, currently under state law, there are two provisions I'll read to you that go back to back. The first is that a local agency may, by ordinance, provide for the creation of accessory dwelling units in areas zoned to allow single-family or multifamily use. And then it goes on to state that the ordinance shall do all of the following. In A, it says, designate areas within the jurisdiction of the local agency where accessory dwelling units may be permitted. The designation of areas may be based on criteria that may include but are not limited to the adequacy of water and sewer services and the impact of the accessory dwelling units on traffic flows and public safety. So currently, those are the standards in state law that allow for some potential flexibility, which is the basis for staff's recommendation regarding the special problems area. But that's something for your consideration if you'd like to expand that or expand the allowance of ADUs or restrict the allowance of ADUs.
So as a suggestion, I think we give staff direction that it's our recommendation that in high fire hazard areas or areas where even, restricted roadways, exiting in case of fires and so forth, we could limit those, and the staff should come back at some point in the future and say, in these special needs areas, special high fire areas, special areas that have concerns with access points, that we restrict ADUs from them, and it sounds like under state law we can do that. I think that makes great sense. That's our job, to protect the public. Do you guys all agree that that's the direction we should go?
I certainly do.
Mr. Chair, I just need to get some clarity because I don't know what the county has in terms of designation of high fire hazard areas. If there's a map that shows these areas or what that is, and perhaps Mr. Lengel can describe it. But I think what I was just did looking at the.
What I was suggesting is the staff come back to us or take to the board those maps. They need to be created. You've mentioned a number of them. We know a number of them, but they just need to create those and take them to the board.
Well, you don't need to create them. The zoning is already in our staff report about these these resource protection zones, and those are the ones that I think are in the high fire hazard areas. They're all on the top of the hills. So I don't know. Maybe we need to hear from Mr. Lengel. There's some balance here about. Perhaps we could make that recommendation immediately. It just says we don't want to allow it in these resource protection zones, which most likely are the high fire hazard areas. I'm guessing, I don't know, but.
Commissioner Brown, maybe we could add on to that and say resource protection zones, there's 4 of them, right? These mountainous, but not limited to these, and then we would like a review to make sure the fire zones are all not just in this area, let's if
there's other high
safety, right?
Maybe it should be an indication that we want to include, if it's not already included in these particular zone districts, high fire hazard areas.
Including but not limited to.
Yeah. I don't know how Mr. Lengel feels about that.
Mr. Lengel.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, the county does have maps that show the fire hazard severity rating for all of the county. It essentially, for most of the South Coast urban area, puts it into either a high fire hazard or very high or severe rating. So if you impose that requirement, it would delete or would take out a lot of properties for having the potential to have an accessory dwelling unit. I would also point out that the fire department representatives to date have not expressed any concerns with allowing accessory dwelling units in the high fire hazard areas. Based on meetings that I had with the Montecito Fire Protection District, their attitude is that The evacuation routes that they've set up are fine, that they can accommodate additional density, and provided that the people adhere to the evacuation warnings and requirements, that everybody should be able to get out in time in face of advancing fire. So again, they do not have a problem with the development of accessory dwelling units within the high fire hazard areas.
And Chair Blau, members of the commission, just to add on to what Mr. Langle said, if you were to restrict based upon the high fire hazard areas or the more severe high fire hazard areas that have been mapped both by the state and locally, it encompasses quite a bit of actually residential zones, particularly within the Montecito area. So I would recommend, if you are going to come up with a way or a justification to limit ADUs in those resource protection zones, that you use a criterion besides high fire hazards to justify why you would impose such a restriction.
Well, I guess for me, I was kind of following your logic on the Mission Canyon Plan area. Tell me how that's different.
Commissioner Blau, Chairman Blau. That policy is in the current Mission Canyon Community Plan. And what we're doing as part of these ordinance amendments do not go into the community plan and try and revise their policies regarding where second units are appropriate or not. So if that would be something for an additional study in the future based on addition to our work program, but it's again nothing that we've contemplated as part of this ordinance amendment work that's we're hoping to complete fairly soon.
And Chair Blau, members of the commission, just add on to that one as well. As Mr. Langle explained earlier too, that was a result of the Mission Canyon Community Plan, and that was subject to very extensive review. And those policies were developed in response to the emergency situations that have occurred in the past, and because of the unique conditions in Mission Canyon, not due to just access, but there's a number of limitations on development there, which have been fully vetted, studied, and the result of those studies are reflected in those policies. So we believe that the study has actually already been conducted, at least for that specific geographical area, to justify those limitations which are set forth in the Mission Canyon Community Plan, unlike other areas of the county which have not been subject to such heightened level of review.
Great. I will just tell my South County commissioners that despite the staff's comments on the fire department, I would still agree that we recommended the board that they not be allowed in the zones that you talked about, or other high fire hazard areas. I don't care if the fire department has said there's adequate evacuation routes. I don't think it's safe. And so for this commissioner, I just assume that the board try and restrict those and not allow them in the high fire zones.
Mr. Chair, maybe what we could do is, just as one of our recommendations to the board, is we request that for these resource protection zones, that ADUs not be allowed. I think that if you look at the maps, I know for Goleta, it's these properties that are way up at the top of the hillsides, not so much down in the lower foothills, but I'm not so familiar with the other two areas. I think Gaviota as well. But that may be a first step. It might be an easier way to express our concern rather than looking at the larger overall high fire hazard issue, which, as staff has indicated, has not been addressed and probably can't be addressed via this ordinance.
Commissioner Cooney, would you like to make a motion to send this on to the board? I'll let you weigh in on
yes,
the...
I would. I think a part of our recommendation has to be that that we believe there is justification under the state law to accept various areas, both in the coastal zone and the non-coastal zone, but primarily the non-coastal zone, from application of the ADU ordinances, and that for me, I can't vote in favor of the ordinances that are proposed, despite the fact that there apparently is a tight time frame. So, however the recommendation goes forward, either along with approval of the existing language or a recommendation that more work be done, I will base my own vote. But very difficult. 90% of what has been prepared and revised and we've seen for almost a year now, I can support. But without taking the extra time and effort to refine what the rest of the county, other than Mission Canyon, might require for public safety, and just blow through it and say, yeah, it's a problem, but we'll deal with that down the line. It's just not acceptable. I think it's our obligation to be alert to this concern and help the board to become alert to it as well.
Mr. Chair, on to another topic. I'd also like to make a recommendation based upon Mr. Mills' comments that that in the next update to the uniform rules, that the board address the ADU issue. On William, that's the uniform rules.
Commissioner Park.
And I agree with that as well. And two things, Chairman Blau. One, do we also need to poll the commissioners about my suggestion that these ADUs for properties that are with houses built prior to 1960 do not require HLAC review, that we adopt the sort of modification that Mr. Langle described?
I would be comfortable with the language. It just simply says that the director may want to refer the house to the HLAC, and it would be the director's discretion, but it not be required. So if staff feels that there's a need that HLAC needs to see it, they can make that recommendation as part of the review, but it not be a requirement that every house that's 50 years old do it. Does that help?
It does, and I figured that had the support of the commission, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah. Does that work for?
Does Mr. Langle have some exact language? I'd like to just see that so that we can vote on it, know what we're voting on. Because he made some recommendation, which I think is appropriate and reflects how the commission feels about it.
Chairman Blau and Commissioner Brown, the language that I previously read provided that the review by the HLAC for whatever era structures would occur unless the director determined that the structure is not historically significant. So following Commissioner or Chairman Blau's direction, we would just sort of turn that around and just included a language that would say that review by the Historical Landmarks Advisory Commission shall be required if the director determines that the structure is historically significant, and leave it as simple as that.
That's perfect for me.
And Chairman Blau, I had just a sort of a procedural question that I certainly can't answer because I'm undecided here. Are we trying right now to come up with a list of recommendations for staff to take back and revise and bring this back to us? Or are we trying to come up with a pretty precise language we would need right now to make a motion to approve this ordinance and send it on to the board? I don't know which path we're trying to take.
Well, I think I have to question of staff has the board given us direction to get this back to them immediately, or can we continue this for another meeting or two and have you come back and address the issues we were concerned today? I mean, if the boss said he wants it back in his lap next week, we're going to put it back in his lap. But if that's not the case, then I think we need to know that.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, there is no hard deadline to bring this back to the Board of Supervisors. Their main concern was that we go back, revise the ordinances in alignment with the revisions to the state statute that were expected to be passed and actually were passed, and then bring it back through the hearing process, through your commission and back to the Board of Supervisors. So if you want to take additional time in crafting your recommendation, you can certainly do that.
Well, I think we're hearing from Commissioner Cooney that he's not going to support the ordinance as staff has prepared it today, that it needs some additional work. I'm hearing, I think, the same thing from Commissioner Park. As far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't mind having you take a closer look at these, what I call high fire hazard areas, and let us weigh in to the board on which ones we think they should be prohibited for health and safety reasons. Do I have concurrence from my South County commissioners?
You do from me, and I'm hoping Commissioner Cooney might have a list that we could go through.
There is a great deal of documentation from recent experience that would enable us, I believe, to identify areas. It really is a separate task, which I think maybe could be done by the time it got to the board, but for us to simply have it stated in the staff letter reflecting the commission's action, I don't think is sufficient. I'd much rather take the time to try and identify a means of indicating that, parallel with this project or as a supplement or something else, the county is going to create a list of high fire and high risk areas that can be accepted from the otherwise very beneficial provisions of the ADU ordinances.
Well, having heard that, is it possible that we go ahead and put this to the board today with the understanding that within 30, 60 days, we're going to have a supplemental list of properties that we think should be excluded from the ADU process? I mean, as you said, it's a kind of a separate track. It's a separate task that they can go through. So I think we can get the other issues resolved so that we're not delaying anybody's ability to do ADUs and other kinds of properties. And let's let the board know that we're going to come up with a series of recommendations for properties that you can't put an ADU on.
Mr. Chair, why don't we ask staff what they'd like, how they'd like to handle that?
Yeah,
I'd like to get input from them.
Chair Blau, members of the commission, you may direct us to go back and do additional research and return to your planning commission. A couple of things to consider, though. As Mr. Legold indicated during his presentation, this law is constantly changing. I'm concerned if this gets delayed much longer, there will be yet another state law that comes into effect between the time at which your commission provides a recommendation. We're back at the board and we're back in this situation again. In other words, we're not going to finish this project. It's going to be ongoing. And I think it's important to try to get something established as quickly as possible. And if changes come up at the state level, which requires surgical changes to what you already adopt, we can do so at that time. And also keep in mind that while we're going through this process, we are having to rely upon the state government code to permit ADU applications that come in right now. So we have even less authority to limit them under the state code as compared to what we are proposing right now. So just some things to take into consideration. Also, next week, I'm going to be presenting to the board the long-range planning work program. If I see that there is a substantial amount of new work that will be involved with this going into next fiscal year, I might have to change our recommendations to the board to account for this additional work. So just some things to keep in mind.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is Ms. Gillen saying that if we don't take an action today and get this to the board, we have very little control, if any, over ADUs. If we go ahead and pass everything and let the board know that we're going to be sending a supplemental list of restrictions, at least we gain some control here today, and we'll get the rest of the control we need later on. And I I get that. I mean, no matter what we do here today, there's no doubt in my mind the state's going to change a bunch of it in another 30 days. They've been changing it every 30 days for the last 6 months. But at least we can start to get some control of issues of setbacks that Commissioner Parks provided for, and a few other things that would kind of make sense. So having said that, I'm going to go ahead and make a motion that we send this on to the board with our recommendations, with the few modifications we've made today. One being that there not be required to have an owner occupancy provision in there. The setbacks that suggested from Commissioner Parks, and notification that we will be sending them a supplemental set of properties that we think should be restricted based on health and safety concerns, and that's likely to come back. We'd hope you would come back with those maps that we can take a look at in the next 30 days, and we can get that to the board. So that's my... And also the recommendation about uniform rule update. Correct. Yeah, so we'll be doing that as well. Ann? Pardon? Oh, and the modifications of the historical land use change, where the director would be required to determine it needs to go to them, not automatically.
I would second that motion.
Mr. Chair, just for clarification purposes, so the motion included deleting the owner occupancy requirements?
Correct.
And it included providing the additional language regarding the location on the lot, suggested by Commissioner Park, and also to put in the revised language regarding Historical Landmarks Advisory Commission review that the director may require if determined to be historical. And then the only other thing I would also add is that the additional language that I proposed regarding the height of the combined structure be included.
That's fine. And the one more thing is that to include in that there will be a supplemental modification of the ordinance dealing with restrictions in high fire hazard areas. We'll vet that later and get it back to them later, but let them know that it's coming. And the reason I do that is, for some reason, the board decides that that's not appropriate, they can kill it right then, and we don't have the staff doing work that they don't want to do. I don't think the board's going to do that, but at least if we put that language in our transmission going forward, if the board agrees with us, then that's giving staff the green light to get that done, get it back to us, get it back to them. And if they don't give us the green light on that issue, at least we know then, and we're not wasting our time and money. Commissioner Parks, you agree with that?
Yes, but I didn't hear Mr. Langle's list include the suggestion that the uniform rules be revised.
Mr. Chair, we'll include that with the letter. That's not a specific modification of the ordinance itself, however.
Okay. Any further discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if I could just explain. I think given this posture, and I appreciate your effort to move this along, get the positive parts of the ordinance moving to the board as quickly as possible. But my feeling is that the public safety, particularly fire risk issues, are so much a concern that the absence of that in the ordinances presented to us today prevent me from supporting it, even though, as I said before, most of it, I do support, and certainly the goals of the state statute guide me on that. And the reason I feel it's important to oppose it is the state law does authorize us to do just what we're suggesting be done. So it should be in the action letter, but maybe to give some reference point in the action letter that could be stated as the reason for my opposition to the current vote.
I think that we could include that. That sounds appropriate to me. Any further discussion? Not seeing any. Mr. Vilbos, would you call the roll?
Well, hang on. Whoa.
Okay.
Whoa, you go too fast there, Mr. Chair. No, I would just like to make a statement, a concluding statement before we take the vote. You know, this ordinance has sort of been like the cannabis ordinance. We, in many ways, we don't know the unintended consequences of what we're proposing here. It's we're trying to do a one-size-fits-all situations, and as we know, one size doesn't fit all, and every time we have that, sometimes we get a mess rather than a very nice, neat cookie-cutter type thing. So I know that we've got our public here who wants to see us go hurry, faster. I prefer a slower approach, a little more deliberate approach, maybe a more restrictive approach, see what happens before and we can always take, with state legislation, it's going to come back and they're going to be fiddling around with all these things, and we're going to have to change stuff anyway. So I'm really supportive of the approach that Mr. Langle has tried to take here, and we can see that we've already made a few changes. So I'm supportive of what we're trying to do. I totally agree about the high fire hazard issue. And it's a problem for me because I want to see this thing get adopted so we have our local standards and not using the state standards, as Mr. Lingle pointed out. So I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further? Not seeing any. Mr. Villalobos, will you call the roll?
Commissioner Park.
Aye.
Commissioner Farini.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney.
No.
Chair Blau.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-1.
Great. And we have one last issue here, if we could. That is, I need to entertain a motion to cancel the April 11th commission meeting.
So moved.
Yes, so moved, and I second the motion.
Great. Mr. Villalobos, call the roll, please.
Commissioner Park.
Aye.
Commissioner Farini.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney.
Aye.
Chair Blau.
Aye.
Motion passes 5-0.
Great. That concludes our business today. Thank you all.
Chairman Blau, could I make just
sure.
one statement as Mr. Langle is gathering to go? This subject today, the more I hear about it, the more complicated it seems. And I think that to be able to come up with a comprehensive recommendation on the ordinance and to field our recommendations takes a kind of a rare blend of talent and experience, and Mr. Langle has that, and he's going to be sorely missed. So thank you very much, Mr. Langle, for both your efforts today, but for throughout your whole career.
Here, thanks.